multiverses are all the rage right now, as we've been talking about, let's all for a moment travel back in time to another reality's 1985, where we're all eagerly awaiting the release of the first big screen Spider-Man movie. We buy our tickets, we get our popcorn, we sit down, but the movie that plays out is very different from what we're expecting. An evil scientist named Dr. Zork transforms an unwilling test subject named Peter Parker into an 8-limbed monster. Just one more addition to an entire army of mutants he has created in a quest for world domination. But what Zork can't foresee is Parker's innate goodness. This literal Spider-Man, formerly known as Peter Parker, escapes Zork's clutches and decides to fight back against the Mad Doctor and his mutant army. Now, I have a confession to make. This is not an actual image from that movie. This is actually a cosplay of Man-Spider, a mutated version of the Spider-Man we all know and love, from the creature design team of Mike and Shelley Carver. I'm guessing it's probably pretty close to what that movie was going for, but we don't really know, because in our reality, Spider-Man co-creator Stan Lee was understandably upset about the proposed modifications to the source material. And he talked the Canon Group, the production studio behind the project, out of making it. So for us, it remains just a curious what if, a more monster movie-driven version of our beloved character. In fact, it was even meant to be directed by a horror legend, Tobe Hooper, best known for Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Now, the idea of the guy behind Leatherface also bringing us Spider-Man might sound strange at first, but then remember, when we finally did get our first big screen Spider-Man series in 2002, it came from Sam Raimi, who at that time was best known as the director of the ultra-gory Evil Dead trilogy of horror films. In fact, Raimi even managed to sneak in an incredibly Evil Dead-esque sequence into his series with the Doc Ock Awakens scene from Spider-Man 2. Almost a little 2-minute horror movie within a movie. And since the success of Raimi's Spider-Man films, we've seen multiple occasions of studios recruiting filmmakers, most known for horror, to take over their superhero franchise. There's just some examples. So there's clearly some sort of connection going on between superheroes and horror, and not just on the screen. There are many examples of the two coalescing on the comic page as well. There's no doubt that to the public at large, the comic medium, especially the American comic medium, is primarily associated with the superhero genre. But not only does the medium obviously have space for and indulge in numerous other genres, it's important to remember the superhero genre, as it were, is not in itself some monolithic, closed-off entity only allowing for one type of storytelling. Quite the opposite. The superhero genre persists and thrives exactly because it's able to welcome and assimilate other recognizable genres into the mix. Batman comics are known for heavily incorporating elements of detective fiction. Green Lantern is both superhero and space opera. The Punisher is a Death Wish-esque vigilante tale. It's not surprising horror would be another genre superhero comics look to integrate. After all, horror has been a part of the American comic scene as long as, if not arguably longer, than superheroes. The aforementioned Stan Lee wrote dozens of horror tales for then Atlas Comics in the 50s before the company rebranded itself as Marvel in the early 60s and pivoted to heavy focus on superheroes. As both overall genres largely concern the otherworldly and supernatural, they perhaps make natural bedfellows. But what about Spider-Man? Yes, it's true, arachnophobia is one of the most common fears, estimated to affect anywhere from 6 to 15% of the world's population. But even still, the web crawler that brought us all here today isn't the first Marvel character that comes to mind when you think about the merger between the superhero and horror. There are certainly other Marvel characters who are probably more obvious examples of this idea. Arguably, the most common perception of Spider-Man is as a more generally family-friendly character, primarily swinging into adventures of a more traditional superhero fare. And I won't deny that Spidey is not, by any means, Marvel's darkest character, and not typically associated with macabre tales of fright. But nor is his long history entirely devoid of these types of stories either. Over his now 60-decade history, our beloved web crawler has encountered the darker, more frightening side of the Marvel Universe on many significant occasions, in tales often meant to contrast Spider-Man's positivity, humor, and sense of hope with frightening, violent, and bleakly oppressive challenges. So I'll be the first to admit, some of Marvel's earlier attempts to blend Spidey and horror were less than impressive, sometimes more superficial and obvious money grabs than a real attempt to combine the genres. So for instance, while it's only natural to be excited by what the cover of 1974's giant-sized Spider-Man and Dracula promises, keep in mind these two panels seen here are the entirety of the two characters' interaction in those 68 big pages.
Yep.
Wow.
Likewise, fans might have been salivating over the prospects of legendary horror artist Bernie Wrightson illustrating the 1986 graphic novel Hooky. But while it did supply Spidey with some of his most grotesque adversaries ever on a visual level, Susan Putney's script is more of an odd, whimsical, dark fantasy than it is the stuff of nightmares. Still good though, read it. I do think, though, Marvel began to show a willingness and even tendency to move Spider-Man stories in a more genuinely horror-adjacent direction with a story we've already heard about, 1987's Kraven's Last Hunt, by J.M. DeMatteis and Mike Zeck. A reworking of a rejected DC story where Joker finally kills Batman, this version, today regarded by many as the greatest Spider-Man story ever, sees a terminally ill Kraven the Hunter, the big game hunter often seeking to defeat Spider-Man as a show of his skills, enact an elaborate plan in his final days. Kraven seemingly kills Spider-Man, though really only rendering him comatose with a paralyzing agent, buries him, and then assumes his identity, doling out a harsher, more violent type of justice to the city's criminals. Also featuring a secondary plot about the sewer-dwelling cannibal creature known as Vermin, Kraven's Last Hunt takes a dark, harrowing look into the psyche of both villain and hero, in the tradition of great psychological horror. And its artwork heavily plays on the tropes of classic Gothic horror, as best evidenced by the now iconic imagery of Spider-Man emerging from his own grave during a dark and stormy night in the cemetery. With the gates now open to allow for more explorations of horror, Spider-Man tales have since explored even more possibilities afforded by the genre. Kraven's Last Hunt, as I just said, dwelt with Gothic and psychological horror, but one can actually find Spider-Man stories that touch on nearly every horror subgenre you can think of. For instance, if one is interested in the sort of atomic age, giant bug invasion, creature feature horror that was so popular in the 50s, they might be intrigued by 2011's crossover event, Spider Island, a monster tale of Spider-Man and the Avengers battling a city full of mutated human-spider hybrids, where not even significant figures from Peter's life are safe from falling victim to the horrifying transformations. If psychedelic Lovecraftian horror in the vein of Alejandro Jodorowsky or Guillermo del Toro is more your style, you might get a kick out of Brendan McCarthy's 2010 tale Fever, which sees Spidey stolen away to a strange dimension where spider demons plan to eat him alive. And speaking of eaten alive, if Vermin and Kraven's Last Hunt wasn't enough for you, and you're in the mood for even more depraved tales of cannibalism, and let's face it, many horror fans are, we're sick, right? Don't worry, Spider-Man actually has you covered. So much so that in 2017, Comic Book Resources published this article, 15 horrifying times Spider-Man villains ate human flesh. Now let's face it, if I'm just here today trying to prove a link between Spider-Man and horror, this headline's actually doing a lot of my work for me. But yes, there have been numerous occasions where Spidey's villains have consumed their victims. None more memorable or horrifying than the 2010 storyline Shed from Zeb Wells and Chris Bachalo. This infamous tale focused on one of Spider-Man's classic villains, the Lizard. Dr. Kurt Connors is a geneticist who injected himself with a lizard DNA serum in an attempt to regrow his missing arm, but was instead turned into a feral human-lizard hybrid. There's always been a Jekyll and Hyde aspect to the character, with Connors resisting and fearing his occasional transformations, and Spider-Man usually helping him regain his humanity. But in Shed, Connors loses control of the beast to a particularly deadly degree. His trapped human consciousness looks on in horror as his now uncontrollable lizard form murders and partially devours Connor's young son, Billy. The act destroys Connor's human mind for good, leaving only the lizard. Spider-Man, always able to pull Connor back from the brink before, is racked with guilt over not being able to save the small child. It's one of the most bleak, horrifying moments in Spider-Man history, and might have set Lizard as the default darkest character in Spidey's universe, if not for an even deadlier, more gleefully sadistic candidate. And so, to return to the list of horror subgenres, if you're a fan of the ultra-violent slasher genre, well, it's time to talk about Carnage. Now, a common critique about the psychopathic, symbiote-enhanced serial killer Cletus Cassidy is that he's especially representative of the comic industry's early 90s push towards more edgy and extreme characters. And that's certainly true to a degree. But I think what's even more significant, and what made him over time a worthy addition to Spidey's rogues gallery, is that he's also the strongest connection of horror Spider-Man has. Throughout the years, the stories of Carnage's seemingly unending killing spree and the visuals that accompany them have continuously pushed the boundaries of what is acceptable in a mainstream superhero comic. Frequently depicting imagery so shocking and violent that honestly, there was a bunch I found which I wasn't even sure if I wanted to project here today. I didn't know if there was going to be any kids in the audience. Now I see I probably would have been fine. I should have gone even more buck wild. Cassidy's past, which can perhaps be critiqued as a melange of common serial killer cliches, nevertheless brings to mind the same sort of twisted origins that many of horror literature and film's most iconic villains have shared. In fact, to me, Carnage wouldn't feel out of place standing right beside characters like Freddy, Jason, and Michael Myers in the slasher Hall of Fame. Perhaps sensing this, Marvel has resisted ever transitioning Carnage into more of an anti-hero role, as they quickly did with his progenitor, Venom. From his creation to now, Carnage has remained terrifying, brutal, and just pure evil. One of the horror greats, Halloween and the Thing director John Carpenter, has said, there are two different stories in horror, internal and external. In external horror, the evil comes from the outside, the other tribe, the people who don't look or think like us, this thing outside in the darkness that we don't understand. But internal darkness is the evil inside us. It's the human heart. The stories we've talked about so far, despite spanning several subgenres, have largely represented external horror. But Spider-Man tales have been just as willing to dive into the internal darkness potentially nestled inside the ultimate do-gooder as well. There have been multiple occasions where readers have met frightening alternate reality versions of Peter Parker, who have used their abilities for far deadlier, more malicious purposes, in stories often constructed to reveal how tenuous the line between hero and villain is, how easily a different upbringing or a tragic change of circumstances could turn a force for good into a fearsome symbol of evil. And even in the regular 616 universe Marvel continuity, Peter has occasionally been transformed into more monstrous beings, such as when he became the aforementioned Man Spider during his time in Savage Land, or more recently, when he was mutated into a horrific spider creature by Baron Zemo in Joe Kelly's 2022 series, Savage Spider-Man. But the horrific potential of Spider-Man as monster fiction perhaps reached its zenith with 2014's Edge of Spider-Verse #4, a multiverse tale by Clay McLeod Chapman and Elia Bonetti, which introduced us to another alternate version of Peter named Patton Parnell, who lives with his abusive Uncle Ted and pines after Sarah Jane, the beautiful redhead girl next door. When Patton is bitten by a radioactive spider on a school field trip, he does not become a superhero, but rather begins a transformation into a bloodthirsty monstrosity, eventually attacking his uncle while debuting his terrifying motto, "With great power comes a great appetite." A little bit of a different ring to it, right? Parnell ultimately lures Sarah Jane to his bedroom, where she discovers a chamber of horrors. While she escapes, the issue ends with a nod to one of the all-time great horror urban legends, as the bite she earlier suffered from Parnell erupts with the birth of hundreds of baby spiders.
Sorry.
This version of the story feels less like the familiar Spider-Man we know, and ironically more analogous to a movie that hit theaters 1 year after the Tobe Hooper body horror take on Spidey was originally meant to be released, David Cronenberg's 1986 body horror masterpiece, The Fly. The parallels between the two stories was a compelling reminder how much superhero stories have in common with the subgenre of body horror, which largely focuses on mutation and transformation in place of mutilation and murder, and derives terror from the notion of some latent otherness making itself known through a physical emergence from or disruption of the body. Parker's transformation in any reality might be caused by science, but they still have an ability to pull at eternal anxieties about the malleability of our own form. For those of us who will probably never have to worry about pumpkin bomb-wielding madmen on gliders or symbiote-enhanced serial killers, the fragility and eventual degradation of our own bodies and the fear of looking in the mirror and seeing someone, something you no longer recognize, that's a much more potent real-life horror. So as we see, the connection between Spider-Man and horror is evident and ongoing. During the Spider-Man Dark Web event earlier this year, Marvel introduced a new Halloween-themed superhero. Hallows Eve, since featured in her own miniseries, uses a set of magical Halloween masks, each imbuing her with the superpower associated with the creatures the mask represents. And just 2 weeks prior to this conference, saw the print debut of Spine-Tingling Spider-Man, a particularly creepy riff on Nightmare on Elm Street from Saladin Ahmed and Juan Ferreira that sees our hero battle a supernatural entity known as the Sleep Stealer, who is able to invade people's dreams and nightmares, Next month, Ahmed and Ferreira are reuniting for a new volume of spine-tingling Spider-Man. A haunted house story Ahmed promises will put Peter, quote, through a grueling horror movie grinder, end quote. The usage of horror will continue to be a powerful addition in the Spider-Man writer's arsenal. Expanding the genre boundaries of the title, creating a more mature and frightening, but also undeniably exciting universe for the character to patrol. When telling the story of a man becoming a spider, there's a thin line between superhero and horror. And perhaps it's for the best when writers occasionally allow that line to bend, if not break altogether. Thank you.
And again, we'll hold our questions to the end, and our next speaker is Mark Parsons.
Is it Identity in Spider-Man and Media? Sorry? Which one's your, I'm sorry, sir. Which one's
I had it on a drive. Yeah.
There.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. And you just the button in the middle?
No, on the right.
On the right. Okay. Okay, so I bought the wrong glasses, so I can't actually see any of you, which is good for nerves. So my name is not Fox Mulder, and welcome to my TED Talk. Let's see. Sorry, I did a bit of improvising. So. Alrighty. So we can all agree that Spider-Man, alongside the cruelly unhyphenated Batman, are two of the most iconic characters in popular culture, instantly recognizable, beloved by countless people, adored by children across cultures and nationalities, and globally famous. Both characters have always been readily accessible to children who delight in dressing up as them and reading or watching their adventures via comics, all ages books, and cartoons. But while Batman's appeal to teens and adults is primarily due to his dark psychological aspects, this aspect is well understood, Spider-Man also has a pop culture shadow that is not often seen. It is not a psychologically dark shadow, although stories that touch upon it, such as Straczynski's The Other, are often disturbing, but it is unsettling and it is deeply weird. Taking this one step further, one step beyond, Spider-Man is uncanny, a term developed by Freud, which we'll get into in a minute, and by the reckoning of many, poorly translated into English. The uncanny, as Sigmund coined it, is the unheimlich, it's a German word, obviously, and we'll get to it in a minute. Actually, preview, sorry, I'm skipping around a little bit. So unheimlich means unhomely, and Heimlich means homely. So according to people who understand German, uncanny isn't it doesn't suggest anything unless you know what the word means, where unheimlich in German says what it is. It's unhomely, it's not warm and familiar. Words of warning: once seen, Spider-Man's alien uncanniness cannot be unseen. May well alter one's understanding of that well-known tagline phrase, your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. So, Peter begins as a teen outsider. He's well-adjusted, but he's an outsider. He doesn't fit into to high school. He's made fun of. His people don't want to go to the science exhibits, etc., etc. Apparently, early on, Ditko, Lee was afraid that a spider character would frighten children or disturb them, and apparently had a discussion with with Ditko, and Ditko strongly advocated that it would be rooted in reality, but the Spider-Man part would be weird. And he won, thank God. So that's kind of reflected in this panel from 15, where you have the kid who's saying what he says, and the mom says, "That's the last horror movie I'll take you to, young man." This sort of unsettling aspect of Spider-Man. And in this second panel, we have him walking down a cable, like he says, effortlessly. But that's a very sort of uncanny, unheimlich, weird thing, right? If you think about it, even if he's super strong, he's actually moving like with the grace of a spider and the weight. It's like, it's irreal, it's strange, it's eerie. It would be a really weird thing to see this in reality. Peter is obviously a trickster. He's funny, but maybe this is a distraction, sort of. This isn't meant to be a categorical definition of Peter, it's just a way of looking at it. And also in regards to Ditko sticking up for him being unsettling slightly, as yet we do not have to look too hard to see how unsettling Spider-Man actually is. His uncanniness hides in plain sight, ever creeping up on us, visible in our peripheral vision, then scuttling away when we turn to it. Peter, Spidey's constant and usually funny inner monologue screens his unsettling aspects, setting us at ease or occasionally annoying us, so that we forget what we thought we saw and what we almost saw, and that what we almost saw was not funny. So that's sort of circling back to these two things where you have this unsettling motion, and you have this boy who's not unsettled, and the woman worried about horror and nightmares. Oops. So some of the terms I'm going to use, obviously on Heimlich, as Freud, come from these books: The Secret Lives of Puppets, and The Weird and the Eerie. One is by Veronica Nelson. Highly recommended. It's very strange. It connects a lot of pop culture to the ideas of the grotesque and strangeness and automata, which is from Freud's Heimlich essay. And the Terminator, everything's in there, the Matrix. It all has roots that go all the way back into European culture. It's a fantastic book. It's mind-blowingly good. And The Weird and Eerie is more of a sort of definition of weird and eerie and uncanny on the spectrum. It's more of a critical book. Cultural criticism. Mark Fisher was an amazing cultural critic who sadly passed away young. And it's a very short book, but he looks at the weird in the music of The Fall, or David Lynch films, Heart of Darkness, all kinds of stuff. Highly recommended. So the idea of puppets and Spider-Man being puppet-like also plays into this weird and eerie spectrum. So I just wanted to pause for a second, just sort of go over what Fisher means by the weird. Is something found in the wrong place. Quoting him, they allow us to see the weird things, allow us to see the inside from the perspective of the outside. So it's unsettling, right? It's something that's getting inside of you, but it's coming from outside. H.P. Lovecraft, another quote: "The weird is a certain atmosphere of breathless, unexplainable dread, of outer unknown forces." So puppets sort of tap into that, right? They move strangely. You know that they're controlled by something else off camera, outside. They can be disquieting. There's a famous marionette theater in Los Angeles called the Bob Baker Marionette Theater. It's fantastic. It's been around for 50 years. I went with my daughter when she was 4, and they had a big show with all the school, and I found it horrifying, terrifying, in a good way. It was really creepy. The puppets were really old and strange looking. But there's that sort of sense of irreality, like what is this we're looking at? There's a little John Romita Jr. sort of sample of him being puppet-like, like a marionette, which you've seen many, many, many times. Eerie would be a present absence. So an animal or a bird cry in the woods, and you don't see it, you don't recognize it, that's eerie, because it's like it's the absence of presence of something, but it feels empty, it feels weird. So Spider-Man leaving webbing and whatnot all over the place might be eerie to some people. when they see it. Like, what is this? If you don't know who Spider-Man is, it's like, what is this man criminal dangling in the middle of the alleyway, festooned with webbing? It would make you feel strange, a sense of eeriness. The uncanny, like I said, is Heimlich and unheimlich, the strange within the familiar. So that's when something, it's like not monstrously strange, it's just somewhat strange. This is like puppets are uncanny, doppelgangers are uncanny, automata are uncanny. A lot of this comes from E.T.A. Hoffman's tale, The Sandman, no relation to the Neil Gaiman Sandman, which is, again, a fantastic, I recommend this short story. It's so bizarre and so intricate and nightmarish, it's incredible. So definitely check that out. So eeriness, circling back to sort of place and absence. I used to see this Spider-Man cartoon when I was a kid, and I enjoyed it, but when I look back on it and watched it in later years, I realized how strange it was. Like, we all know that if you've seen it, it's made very cheaply. There's almost no sort of extra characters in it. You know, it's always headshots, two shots, this, that. They use the same Spider-Man swinging shots over and over again within the episode. Like, they'll use it, like, I'm talking about like 9 or 12 times, it's the same stuff. There's no one on the streets usually, and often the skies are kind of like the skies you see here. They're watercolors, they're nightmarish and strange. So you get this sort of sense of this is a city, but it's not a city. I mean, obviously it's the budgetal limitations of cartoons, but it also has this eerie, weird effect. You know, Peter's this normal guy. It sounds like a banker. It's really a kind of a disappointing voice. It's a great voice, but it's just kind of weird if you think about other actors' interpretations of Spider-Man. And this is a famous episode, just as an aside. It's called Escape from Dementia 5. It was considered so disturbing it was not put into syndication. You have to watch it. If you've never seen the Spider-Man cartoon, just watch this one. Ralph Bakshi made it. He stole a lot of images from another cartoon he'd done, like this hand, called like Robin Hood. It's a sci-fi Robin Hood take. And it's completely insane, right? Have you seen it?
No,
Oh, okay. It's nuts. So another little thread to recommend there. Sorry, I'm trying to follow this along. So again, tapping into all the weird, the eerie, the uncanny. They're all on a spectrum. Jung is in there with shadows, the shadow self. So we see here the other. Just from the Straczynski story, we see one version of the other which is sort of made of spiders. We see another manifestation of it saying, what is it saying? Sorry. It's saying something fabulously creepy. Just enlarge this. Embrace me. So, you know, all of this darkness, all of this weirdness, all of this uncanniness, and all of this, in this case, shadowedness, it's always there in Peter's life. You know, he's been bitten by a spider. He's been given these powers, which is a really weird thing. Also, Straczynski did the story where you find out that the spider totem actually sent a sort of tiny psychopomp into this lab, and it was going to bite him and empower him, and it got zapped by radiation, and the radiation killed the spider. So Spider-Man actually isn't an irradiated Marvel superhero like they all were. He's, in this version that Straczynski tells, he's a mythical character. He's coming from some weird Jungian totemic space. The spider totem is a powerful force, and as explained in the story, I think Ezekiel says, why you think all these people going after you are rhinos and scorpions and vultures and octopuses. Those are all people who want to be totems for these things, but they're not.